we call it the $1 million question, which is basically, what are you tolerating? Because what you're tolerating are the very places that you're going to actually stay stuck in terms of your growth.
Welcome, everybody, to Center Stage. My guest today is Vanessa Shaw. I'm really excited about this conversation. I've had the opportunity to have conversations with Vanessa over the years. She is a great business strategist. And so really good to have you on the show, Vanessa. Why don't we start by, just for those that haven't heard of you, just give us the quick kind of bio in terms of who you are and tell us about your business.
I will do. And it's so good to be reconnected as well, because it has been quite a few years. So I'm 20 years in business this year myself, and a whole range of different coaching. So we're very much in the coaching and training space. My claim to fame, Danny, and I don't even know if you know this, was I pioneered probably the first ever big virtual coaching program in a major law firm back in about 2006 in Europe. And that was cross-border, multiple countries. So that's kind of how I got into the whole big law space, learned an awful lot around law firms, corporate law and all the rest of it, and biz dev and everything that needed to happen. And then 13 years ago, I left Europe, came to the States, and in my business, then I kind of went into small business. Like small business and small firms is really where my heart is at, not the big corporate gigs. And so for a few years there, we were kind of more generic businesses, like that were under the small business banner. And then really in the last year, we've been like niching down into women-owned law firms, because they keep showing up in my world. And as I always say to my clients, you have to analyze who your favorite clients are and like how do you replicate them. And when we went through that, it was like, oh yeah, they're all women-owned law firms. So like, the evidence is there. Let's do this.
Love it. Well, I know that kind of as we talk about law firms, and obviously our audience, I think probably 95% of the folks listening to this own a small law firm. And I know that this conversation is going to be relevant to, male-owned law firms and female-owned law firms. But
Totally.
I am curious, just kind of upfront, like, what are some of the unique challenges that you see specifically that women-owned small law firms like bump into?
Yeah, and there's layers of this, right? There really are layers of this, because we get asked a lot, well, can't you work with me? And like, in theory, yes. But we've really decided to go like all in on women. I would say like one of the big ones is the law industry is inherently masculine, right? It's been dominated by guys, since its inception. And so what we're finding is a lot of the women that we're working with now want to do things differently, and they don't want to do things the traditional way. But yet they're still very much in that mindset. And sometimes it's that mindset of, the big rainmakers, a lot of hustle, it's all about getting the billable hours in and all of those things. And the women that we're working with are like, we want to break away from this. Like we're really tired of that model. It doesn't work for us. It doesn't always work for us at stages of life. And a lot of my women right now, they could be having, they might be going into empty nesting. Some of them have got even younger kids, but then they're also, looking after aging parents, right? That's a spot that I find myself in, right? Like literally today. And so there can be a lot of tension and stress to kind of do all of those things. And so they very much want to build their firm around, like, I want a firm that supports me, that doesn't, that's not always getting me completely stressed out. So I think that's like one of the big areas. And we do know, right? I think it's probably the elephant in many rooms. Like the law, being in the industry of law is very, very stressful. Like the nature of the work, often the nature of the things, it can be very combative as well. We know that there's a lot of stress and a lot of burnout. And so we're working very hard to go like, let's not go down the route of like those models that frankly just lead to that and contribute to it. Let's do things differently.
I
So
love that.
yeah, so I say that's kind of number one. Number two that I do want to touch on, and this is just a topic that I'm passionate about. But by the way, men listening in, some of you are going to go, yeah, and I also relate to that as well. But the piece around finances, right? Like that's another huge piece that we help our women with. women have a different relationship to finances and money compared to men. Again, it's been taught a very masculine way. A lot of women, and myself included, have like struggled to sort of understand these concepts. We are having a more an emotional relationship with money as well. So again, our approach to that is very distinct to the traditional ways. And I think for a lot of our women, they want to have a safe space where they can frankly just be themselves, have these conversations behind closed doors that are very pertinent to them. But to your point, Danny, we could have a room full of guys as well, and they could also
Yeah.
be saying, yeah, we're
Well,
challenged by that too.
and that makes so much sense. And the first part of what you were describing really resonates with me too. And I really think a lot of, you know, ultimately, if you own a law firm, you own a business. And, if you own a business, one of the benefits, right, which we need to take advantage of the benefits because there's a lot of stress that comes with owning a business,
Yes.
right? And it's the idea that you can shape your business to support your priorities outside of life or outside of your business, the rest of your life. And so whether that's, caring for aging parents or being there for your kids or whatever, I think that is just a tremendously important topic, which is just how do you build a business that works in harmony with the life that you want instead of just sucks all the life out of you. So
Totally.
so
Totally.
that's
Yeah.
awesome. And with kind of with that said, one of the things I've heard you talk about is just this idea that working harder isn't always the answer. Um, it's not just working harder to grow your law firm. Like that's not the right way to think about it. So talk about that. That's one of those things that kind of caught my attention.
Right. And again, I think so if we go back to, I think, like the traditional model of law firms, there has been such a focus on billable hours, right? Getting those hours in, like that's how we, kind of grow, like let's maximize those things. And then as we know that what often happens is when we start to look at the math of trying to do the billable hours, plus everything else that has to be done, and especially in a small firm, when we don't have all the massive resources of like multi-million-dollar or billion-dollar firms, which is what I used to work in. It's like, so when is all the other stuff happening, right? Because it's not just billable hours, right? There's an awful lot that goes around that. So I think that's the kind of the traditional model. And it's also been a model where kind of the busier you are and like the higher the billable hours and everything, it's all worn like a badge of honor. So we've got to, we have to kind of acknowledge that that exists. And then it's like, that's the working harder, like really hard. Um, the working smarter, which of course we hear in the business world a lot, right? But I don't think people really realize what it means. So coming back to, in fact, what one of the things that you just touched upon there, the very first thing actually about working smarter is frankly an internal mindset shift. And this is about moving away from being the, law practitioner to being the CEO of the business. Like you touched on that immediately. Like it's you have a law firm, but it's a business, right? It just happens like the product is law. And many attorneys aren't making that shift, right? Which keeps them in this kind of like this traditional billable hours. They're doing all of the work, more work, more work, more work. And they're not thinking through that lens of like, now I've got to be that CEO business owner. So I always say like, that's the first, like in terms of being smart, that's where we've got to shift first and foremost and like start to put some business structures, business, mindsets, business approaches, right, in place.
Yeah, no, I love that. If I could just jump in there for a
Yeah.
second, you know, one thing that I've sort of, I don't know, observed over the years, because we work almost exclusively with small law firms and we're a marketing agency, but we end up having a lot of these conversations, right? Because one of the things that happens is when your marketing starts to work and you start bringing in more clients, that creates some stress, right? Now we've got more work to do, and so one of the things that becomes clear to me is that there are some small law firm owners out there who really don't want to be the CEO of the business and they just want to practice law. And it's like, and I think that's okay, but you have to be real about that. And like, maybe that means you're actually better off working for a law firm. And if you just want to do the legal work all day, there's nothing wrong with that. Or you can hire somebody to you can build a leadership team and you can practice law and you can have someone else be that CEO of your business. I mean, do you see that any differently?
Yeah, I mean, it's rare. The owners that we work with, I think it's probably, hopefully, Danny, you're the marketeer here, right? But hopefully our marketing's hitting the mark, because the reality is the owners that we attract do want to be out of like what they call lawyering, right? All the lawyering stuff. So those are the conversations that we are having most of the time. And honestly, I don't think I've had one conversation with somebody where they've said, no, I just want to do the work. I want to get the work. I want to do the work all day long, and let me bring in somebody else to kind of run the
Love
show.
it.
So that's,
So then bring us back to sort of those initial conversations when you do sit down with a law firm owner who does want to transition into that more CEO role, where what are those conversations like? How do you help them start making that shift?
yeah. So as you said, it's like, okay, do you want to grow? Do you want to make that, like, let's just get clear that that is what you want to be doing, right? And it's not just, you just want to find a way to add an extra 20,000 a year, because that's, again, not the conversations that we're in. From there, and frankly, this probably aligns very much with your work, but I mean, we'll come back to, typically speaking, once those firms turn up at our door, they've cobbled things together, right, over the years, like we all did to get into business. So, you fly by the seat of your pants, you throw a few things out there, it works. They're typically taking anybody that comes through the door, in terms of clients, because they don't have like a good, sales pipeline, solid marketing system. So it's that oh, well, I don't really know where the clients are coming from. They haven't got systems and structure in place. They probably aren't really thinking about leveraging team either. So this is when we come back to like let's work smarter, not harder. So one of the very first things, I mean, we'll often do is with the owner themselves. It's starting with them. We start to look at like, what do we need to get off of your plate? And frankly, we call it the $1 million question, which is basically, what are you tolerating? Because what you're tolerating are the very places that you're going to actually stay stuck in terms of your growth. So we'll start to do kind of like a big brain dump around all of those things that, they're not energetically aligned with, it's below their pay grade. We'll often do an analysis of, where are you spending your time? And we'll find out that, their hour could be worth $500, but yet they're spending it on, $20 tasks.
Yeah.
That's an example, right there, of like, this isn't smart, because it's costing you potentially $480 to do that task, when you could give it to somebody else who will probably do it a lot better and quicker than you anyway.
I love that. Vanessa, my business partner and I, this was years ago, as we were first starting to scale our business. Now we're a team of about 22 or 23, but it was just him and I at the beginning, and we fortunately read the book E-Myth.
Mm.
And the exercise you just described reminds me of kind of how we approached it based on that book, which was, we literally created what's called a task hierarchy. And in that book, in E-Myth, it's referred to as a task hierarchy. And what that
Okay, I didn't
basically
know
is,
that term. I know E-Myth. I'm just not
yeah.
familiar with like yeah, okay.
And basically what we did was, for about 2 weeks, we just wrote down every single function within the business that we performed, everything from like writing marketing copy for our
Mhm.
next big campaign down to like taking out the trash.
Yes.
And then we just organized it by dollar value, right? And so to your point, it's like, all right, this work up at the top of the task hierarchy, things like planning our big marketing campaign and things like that, very valuable. Taking out the trash, that's $12 an hour work. Like,
Yep.
why am I spending my time on that? And then we started building our first job descriptions just based on, how do we get the lower level task off our plate.
And that's exactly, so that's, and that is the process, right? E-Myth is very well known. We're just kind of approaching it from a different way. Women, by the way, again, if we go back to the women centric, they kind of like this idea of the lens of the tolerations as well,
I love that.
right? Because a lot of them have just kind of been conditioned to take on stuff, not complain, and in a way, it's very freeing, because it's like, no, we're giving you permission, like we're getting this stuff off your plate. So we've got to start with the leader, right, the owner, or owners sometimes, and like start to free up that time, because as you know, working with attorneys, one of the biggest objections, I would say, is I haven't got time. Like, I haven't got time to grow. And I always counter with, like, give me a couple of hours because I can easily find 4 to 8 hours every single week. And that's on the low end, right? That you are spending in the wrong places.
Can
Um,
you do you have as you're talking about that, are there any sort of like specifics that hop into your mind as I know you have a lot of these conversations? Like what are some of those like lower level tasks or the tasks that aren't energetically aligned that you're often
right?
able to help people get off their plates?
Great question. I mean, I'll give an example. There was one, and I was like, I said to one of my clients recently, I said, that is not CEO stuff. And she says, she says, I have that on my computer now, Vanessa. Vanessa said, that is not CEO stuff. But for example, all the prepping of documents. This is an estate planning attorney. Yes, she's having to build up her team again and everything. But all of the documents that go into the binders that to hand over at the signing, she was putting the binders together. That's an example of you can so easily hire that out. A lot of the admin stuff, like even and simple things. I mean, they sound so simple, and people are like, it doesn't take me that long. But getting people scheduled on calendars. Frankly, some of the emails that really are non-legal and somebody else could be sorting out. As I said, there's a lot of admin. We are completely against attorneys doing their own bookkeeping. We have a lot of resources in that area. We're like, you're an attorney, you're not a bookkeeper. That's not something you should be doing. Um, so, as I say, a lot of admin, sometimes it's the billing, it's chasing up payments. These are all not $500 tasks. Not to mention, as you said, they could be taking out the trash, they could be ordering printer cartridges. If they're hosting a seminar, I'm like, you need to turn up at the seminar and do your magic. That's your 500 an hour task, and you're in a biz dev role. But booking the venue, getting all the things, getting out things, printed material, ordering the catering, for example, right? That's not. So it depends, Denny, but guaranteed, I know that there's an awful lot. That's why I say we can look at it. And sometimes, once we start to get some of the obvious things, delegated, I'm then like, let's look at the process to start to see, when we get more advanced, it could be intake, initial consultations at a screening, for example. But like we can easily train somebody else to do those so that the main consultation is with a screened client. And again, this is working smarter, not harder, because now we're working with our perfect fit clients and we're not doing all of these preliminary calls beforehand. So then we start to look at like where can we hand off things and get the attorneys like really scaled back into what we would refer to as like their zone of genius and the highest value
Yeah.
activities.
I love that. And I want to touch on the last piece of that you brought up because again, to me, from the marketing perspective, you know, being clear on who the right clients are for your law firm is just so important. And that's a theme that comes up a lot on this podcast. And I always I tell people like, listen, as a marketing agency, we're happy to have some strategic conversation with you and help you, hone in, figure out how to reach your ideal clients and maybe, how to hone into, what are their priorities, what are their values, how are we going to create messaging that's persuasive to them. But at the end of the day, I can't tell a law firm owner who their ideal clients need to be, right?
No,
Because it does need to be such a personal decision. Because my perfect client could be very different than your perfect client. But I do find that like many law firms, maybe the majority of small law firms, don't actually put a lot of thought into this and they end up we refer to it as door law. It's
yeah,
whoever shows up and is willing to write a check, we'll take your business, whether that's estate planning or divorce or bankruptcy. So can you talk at all about kind of that and any
totally.
any thoughts on how a law firm can start thinking that way if they haven't
Yeah.
been?
Because it's kind of like, frankly, it's probably in our next step. There's a couple that happen together. One's around the finances, one's around what we call champagne clients, ideal clients. So we have a terminology which is champagne, wine, and beer. And on the whole, beer clients shouldn't be anywhere near the firm. They're the ones that nickel and dime, don't pay on time, leave bad reviews, drain everybody. So that we feel like is fairly self-explanatory. But yes, to your point, we find as well most law firm owners have never really thought about this. So we start to look at, and I look at it slightly differently to probably a marketing agency. There's a little distinction in there because I look at it through the lens of the practitioner level too, in that, attorneys, even if they want to ideally get to be CEO and like get out of practicing law, which some of ours do, it's still going to be a process. And over the course of those years that it would actually take to build that, I'm like, there are perfect fit clients for you and your expertise and the problems that you love to solve. And as a practitioner, you are going to want to have more complex cases or more juicy things or more impactful clients to work with. Because if we're just, as you know, if you've been practicing for 30 years and you're doing the same stuff, for sure you're going to get burnt out. So looking at it through that lens often helps them to still think about, yes, oh, okay, these are the conversations that I love to have all day long, right? That I'd be happy to have. What is the practice area? So we're definitely all about niching as well. Like we're not going to be a full service law firm because it's difficult, especially with small resources. It's difficult to build the systems. And if you only do, one personal injury case once every 2 years, you're like dipping back into, what are all the things you need to update yourself with? It's like, it's just, again, it's more work than it needs to be. And then oftentimes what we'll do is, let's go through and now let's look at the finances. And that's when it gets really interesting is most of the firms that we work with are already over about 300,000 in revenue. So we're still in that small space, scaling up to 7 figures plus. But when we get them to analyze like their finances, we can often find out that it's that 80-20 rule that comes in that they'll say, I'll have them print out a list of their clients. And I say, I just want a quick gut check. Champagne, wine, beer, champagne, wine, beer. Don't overthink it. Let's color code it. And then we start to look at the ones that come up as champagne. Oftentimes they may only represent 20% of their book of business. And it can be so interesting to see that, okay, what are those 20% actually bringing in terms of the finances? Are they bringing in this? It's not necessarily 80 at that point, but we find it's often the majority.
Yeah.
And they've got like so many small transactional clients that are, again, not a joy to work with. So once we start to see that through the lens of their numbers, their practitioner, and their skills that they have, often then the next thing becomes, which Danny, this is obviously the music to your ears as a marketeer, but it's like, oh, amazing, we've defined them. How do I now get in front of them?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love it. And I was about to say from like a marketing perspective, we love it when we have a conversation with a law firm owner who's got that picture painted of I love the terminology champagne client, ideal client, perfect client. Like
Yeah.
we love that because once you've identified that, then it actually just becomes it's almost a math equation. It's like, okay, well, where do they hang out?
Yes.
How do we get you in front of them, right? And and of course there's some messaging strategy, right? Like we're big proponents of story brand and sort of that formula of
Story brand. Yeah.
really understanding what motivates them.
Mm-hmm.
But like, yeah, like doing that foundational work is so important. So I love that we talked about that. So Vanessa, our time is running short here. I feel like we could probably talk all day. This has been awesome. I have one last sort of question for you, but before I get there, do tell folks who are listening in how they can connect with you, learn more about you and your work.
Totally. So main website is businessgrowthacademy.com. It does not have a the in front of it, businessgrowthacademy.com. We have launched something new as well recently, again, for our women-owned law firms only. Sorry, guys, I know it sounds good and juicy, but we've launched a community called the Legal Collective. And this is a monthly free community where I'm going to be sharing like tools and frameworks and cheat sheets and everything. But it's also a place where attorneys can build their power partners and referral partners. So that, again, they can see on the website. And then, of course, the LinkedIn, pretty active over on LinkedIn and also on Instagram. And a little fun detail is we also have, or I have, a podcast that's called Get Rich Without Being a Bitch. So there's a lot of just free content and tools in many different places to find us.
Wonderful. That is awesome. Okay, so I wanna end it here. So, our audience, small law firm owners, there are plenty, I'm sure, who are in that state of stress and burnout, right? And
Yeah.
so, we've had a lot of conversation, I think, that's applicable to people who want to sort of move their business past that stage. But if you were to leave sort of like one action step or one thing to think about, we're big on action and action steps. And so what would be sort of one piece of advice you have for the listeners right now who are maybe a little overwhelmed by running their law firm?
Honestly, I would probably come back to this. There's two ways I could answer that because I think having a vision of what you really want to create is very powerful. And again, I would say most law firm owners don't have that. It's like, what do you really want the ideal, like, firm by design, not default to look like? And actually, that's a really should be a fun exercise as well for people to go through. Like that's the sort of stuff, dedicate a few hours, have a coffee, glass of wine, and paint that vision so that somebody else could really see it and that it's specific. Now, when we look at overwhelm and stress, getting into vision can be really tricky. It's like because we're just too bogged down. And so that's where I would come back to answering the $1 million question. Like starting off with that list of what are all the things I'm tolerating, whether it's team members, lack of systems, finances, things aren't adding up. I'm not paying myself enough, too many hours, broken chair at the desk that I still haven't fixed. I mean, whatever it is, because even giving that list and seeing it is hugely insightful. And then typically with that list, there are probably one or two really big things that if they were changed, and we talk about raising standards, so you're no longer tolerating them, they would have this huge domino effect, and they're probably really holding the owners back. But equally so, there are probably a few things on that list that are really quick wins. And I love, in terms of like getting some quick wins and getting some energy going. So that's honestly what I would say is a great place to start. And this is, again, it's working smarter, not harder. You don't have to, my attorneys that are running $1 million firms, I can promise you they're not doing 60 hours a week. They've got time off, they're paying themselves really well, they're loving life again, they're taking vacations. And this is exactly the process that we took them through.
Fantastic. Vanessa, that was awesome. Thank you again for joining us. Always a pleasure to catch up with you, and we'll talk soon.